Chapter 1679, Beacon of Hope. There were two ways to build a domain. One was provided by the spell and depended on the citadels. By becoming the master of a citadel, or having a person who had accepted your authority become one, a supreme could empower and expand their domain over vast territories. A citadel was much more than just a stronghold containing a gateway. It was a daunting construct of impossible sorcery that forcefully subjugated the part of the world surrounding it and brought it under the rule of a supreme. That was why both the King of Swords and the Queen of Worms, who controlled most of the human territories in the dream realm, were so immensely powerful. The second way was innate to each transcendent and unique to their aspect. Nephis suspected that most domains were territorial in nature, which was the reason why the spell had based its method on territory. But not all of them were. Take the King of Swords, for example. He used the path provided by the citadels to expand his domain, but that did not mean that he limited himself to it. The true vessels of his authority were not lands, but people. Every warrior wielding a sword forged by him was a part of his domain, and thus empowered it. Kai Song collected the dead. There was the mysterious Asterion as well, who didn't seem to rule any citadel. As for Nephis herself, the only way for her to build a domain was to inspire people, igniting the flames of yearning in their souls. At least that was her belief. It had taken countless hours of contemplation and meditation for her to learn how to truly sense the underlying source element of her aspect. She had noticed the subtle shift in her presence first, or maybe that subtle quality had always been there, too weak to be discerned. The souls of people shone brighter in Neph's presence, their innermost hopes and aspirations igniting with a stronger flame. Her presence was like kindling for their passions, turning desire into yearning. And if that yearning was inspired directly by her, or even the idea of her, then a subtle connection was established between them and Nephis, making the inspired a part of her source element. She had not learned to sense these connections swiftly, though. In fact, it had taken a small breakthrough in mastering her aspect legacy for Nephis to grasp the deeper meaning of longing. Her aspect legacy was a tree of knowledge that bore 7 fruits. She had reaped the benefits of one of them and comprehended the knowledge of fire in twilight. Since then, Nephis had made strides in comprehending a few others. Facing the first seeker in Verge, she had advanced considerably toward the knowledge of corruption. And in the last 4 years, she had not only fully mastered the knowledge of destruction, but also started on the path of comprehending knowledge of passion. It was that last branch of her aspect legacy that had helped her fathom the underlying nature of her aspect better, as well as what she was concentrating on mastering now. Nephis had learned how to sense the subtle connections formed between her and those she inspired. She had also earned the ability to vaguely feel the passions and desires of those around her, which were like sparks and flames burning in their souls. Of course, not everyone was easy to read. The Lord of Shadows, for example, was like a closed book, especially when he wore that mask of his. In any case, after Nephis had gained that understanding, she found out with a bit of surprise that there were already countless people in the world who were connected to her. As it turned out, her fame was the reason. From the day she had led the Dreamer army to siege the Crimson Spire and failed to come back with them, the mighty propaganda machine of the government churned, exaggerating her inconceivable achievements and making her into a tragic hero. A truly brilliant figure, indomitable changing star, the last daughter of the immortal Flame clan. They had even built on the legendary fame of her father and grandfather, turning her into a symbol of human valiance and perseverance. For as long as immortal flame burned, humanity would not be extinguished. These words were spoken often now by the people born into the era of the nightmare spell. There were even movies made about her, horrendous as they were. Her sensational return as the only sleeper in history to conquer the second nightmare had only deepened the reverence and veneration people felt toward her, followed by her adoption into valor, which added the great clan's storied prestige to her own. So, by the time Nephis became a saint, there were already numerous people for whom she was an inspiration. And after she became a saint, their numbers only continued to grow. She could feel it clearly. Some were inspired to strive for martial strength. Some were inspired to cultivate the nobility of their characters. Some were inspired to live their lives with earnest confidence, and so on. There were even many people inspired with a straightforward carnal desire because of her looks. It was a bit awkward for her to sense the kind of yearning they had for her when she was out and about, and pretend not to notice. In any case, the foundation of her future domain was already vast and potent. But it wasn't vast enough, and it wasn't potent enough. And so, in the past 4 years, Nephis had endeavored tirelessly to make it even more solid, to touch the souls of even more people. She had learned how to carry herself, how to present a perfect facade to the masses. She poured her intellect into grasping the knowledge of passion. More importantly, she put her sword where her mouth was. In that sense, the way Clan Valor treated her was ironically of great help. They always sent her to the most deadly battlefields, dispatched her into the epicenters of the most dreadful calamities, as if wishing for her to die. Wherever there was a crisis, Changing Star and her fire keepers would arrive, dissipating a flood of nightmare creatures with their swords. Nephis played along with the will of Clan Valor, using these opportunities to show the world her incorruptible will and brilliant radiance, which made her fame even more widespread and exalted. Cassie, meanwhile, worked behind the scenes to guide the narrative and fan the flames. Nephis herself, the ivory tower, the chain breaker, the fire keepers, everything was now a recognizable symbol of selflessness, strength, and nobility. They were beacons of hope in a dark and tumultuous world, bringing people solace and inspiration. The number of those touched by her light grew every day, forming countless connections to her soul. Not all of these connections were equal. Some were tentative and feeble, some were radiant and deep. The deepest connections by far were those of the fire keepers, her most loyal followers. It was to a degree that she could even reach them with her aspect abilities from a distance. That was one part of what Nephis was doing, the easier part. The harder part by far was coming up with a way to actually turn this spiderweb of connections, the nascent form of her future domain, into an actual one. Nephis still had no idea how to take this step. She had spent some time studying the changes that had happened to her soul sea after she bound the ivory tower and let the fire keepers place their anchors there, hoping to find a clue from the mysterious mechanisms of the nightmare spell. But that had turned out to be a dead end. So for now, Nephis was left with no choice but to search and wait. She had hoped that she would find a hint before the war started, but now that both of the great clans were on the move, that didn't seem possible anymore. Which was why it was so important for her to establish a foothold in Godgrave and ready herself for what was going to happen here. Anvil and Kai Song had to fall before the war was over. Because if one of them truly defeated the other, their authority would spread to all of humanity. Once that happened, even becoming a supreme would not be enough to slay them. The unconscious sleeper slowly opened her eyes, staring at Nephis with a dazed look. She smiled reassuringly and rose, picking up her sword again. There was not much time left. The enemies were approaching. Towering above the three of them, Nephis and the two teenage girls, the Lord of Shadows said coldly, "It's sweet that you promised to save them, but how are you going to do it? Once we start fighting with those abominations, a single shockwave will be enough to finish these two off." Nephis climbed out of the pit and helped the girl she had healed up. Tamar followed. "Good question." There was no time to run away, because the Usras were faster than them. Flying away wasn't an option either, because they would be perfect targets in the air. One toss of a diamond weapon, and there would be no escape. Even if Nephis could evade, she had to carry at least one of the sleepers, and neither of the girls would survive the crushing pressure of such maneuvers. She considered countless strategies in a single second and looked up at the Lord of Shadows. "You take them and retreat. I'll hold the enemy off and then join you." He remained silent for a moment and then said flatly, "I refuse." Nephis blinked. Huh. She had not expected that answer. "Why?" The shadow demon bent down, bringing his onyx helmet level to her face. The darkness nestling inside it was deep and impenetrable. "You might be fine dying for these sleepers, changing star, but I am not fine with you dying." One of his onyx claws pointed at her. "You still owe me a favor, remember. Wouldn't I be cheated if you died before repaying me?" Nephis tilted her head. At that moment, she thought that she felt a hint of desire from the Lord of Shadows. Some people's longing was like a spark, some people's longing was like flame. His, though, to her, it felt like a towering pyre that dwarfed everything around. As it turned out, the Lord of Shadows was a man of dire passion behind that cold exterior. She couldn't make out the details of what exactly he yearned for, but his unwillingness to see her dead before she made good on her promise, at least, seemed rather sincere. It looked like the favor he intended to ask from her was not simple. A moment later, his soul was shrouded in darkness once again, and she couldn't feel anything. Nephis sighed. "What do you propose, then?" The Lord of Shadows lingered for a moment. Then he scratched his horned head, the onyx claws scraping piercingly against the surface of his helmet. Finally he sighed. "I'll take them to the nameless temple and return. You stay alive while I'm gone." Wasn't that basically what she had suggested? Nephis raised an eyebrow. "How long will it take you to make it back to the citadel and return, Lord Shadow?" He raised one of his 4 hands and bent a few fingers, then answered evenly. "About 6 seconds." She stared at him silently. Then she stared some more. "Huh. You could make a trip from the citadel to here in 3 seconds, this whole time. Why did we fight our way here through the jungle then?" Usually, Nephis had to make an effort to put emotions into her naturally deadpan voice. But now, she was actually struggling to maintain composure and make it sound calm. It was an extremely rare occurrence. The Lord of Shadows shrugged indifferently. "It would have consumed too much of my essence. Carrying these sleepers is fine, but you are too heavy of a burden." Nephis stared at him silently for a moment, then glanced down involuntarily. Her body was lithe and slender, like it had always been. "Definitely." "Huh." The Lord of Shadows remained silent for a moment, too, then added suddenly, his cold tone suspiciously close to sounding a tiny bit rushed. "Because you are a transcendent. Your soul is too vast and powerful, that was what I meant." He took a step forward and placed 2 of his 4 hands on the shoulders of the speechless sleepers. "Anyway, time is of the essence, so I'd better go." A moment later, the 3 of them dissolved into shadows, leaving Nephis alone in the small clearing. A spatial movement ability. She remained motionless for a second, then looked at herself again. A quiet mumble could be heard. "Did I gain muscle?" Sure, she was not as delicate and pretty as Cassie, and not as elegant and graceful as Sation, but Nephis was pretty confident in her figure. Granted, it wasn't as generous as Effie's. What am I even thinking about? Just at that moment, the jungle around her exploded, and 7 ghastly golems lunged at her from all sides, the world groaning in agony from the violent force of their passing. Nephis was still looking down. Before they could reach her, though, her body exploded with a brilliant radiance, and their towering figures were consumed by blinding light. Nephis had transformed into a spirit of light. In that state, Her graceful body seemed to be woven out of immaculate white radiance. That radiance contained an unfathomable ocean of furious flame instead of flesh and bone, and was a beautiful vessel for her fiery, titanic soul. She was like a brilliant star that had taken the form of a human. The moisture permeating the humid air instantly evaporated. The rotten leaves blanketing the ground turned to ash. The remains of the dead tree blackened and caught fire, being consumed at startling speed. But the speed with which the mystical wood was being consumed by the white flame was nothing when compared to the speed with which Nephis moved. Unconstrained by the limitations of mundane flesh, her power exploded. The whole clearing was flooded with blinding light, and the towering figures of the Asuras dissolved in that light. They weren't destroyed, but the red moss covering their cracked armor was immediately incinerated. The mummified flesh within the stone carapaces blackened and smoldered. The 7 diamond weapons fell in unison, but Nephis effortlessly danced out of the way. Almost at the same time, she was suddenly in front of one of the abominations, her radiant fist brushing lightly against its stone breastplate. The massive creature was thrown back. The armor on its chest cracked and melted, and the thick armor plate on its back exploded, shards of stone turning into molten rain as they fell to the ground. The world was stark and clear, awash in annihilating pain. 3 more seconds. Nephis wondered how many of these nightmare creatures she would be able to kill before the Lord of Shadows returned. In the form of the radiant spirit, Nephis was much more powerful than her human incarnation. Her speed and might increased vastly, and her fire powers grew much more potent, especially when the beautiful vessel of light was augmented 7 times over by her aspect. Not only that, but mundane attacks could not hurt her at all. Most weapons would simply turn to ash before reaching her, and those that did break through the immolating heat would find no flesh to harm behind it. Only fire. So what hurt her the most was her flaw, the pristine soul, and in that form the danger it posed was much more dire than the suffering she experienced when using her lesser abilities. The incandescent white void of her soul was so pure and searing that it threatened to consume her, burning away her very self, perhaps forever. At least that was what Nephis feared. She rarely used the power of her aspect in combat, relying on nothing but her martial prowess if there was a choice, and she used her transformation ability even less frequently. Of course, she was not invulnerable even in that brilliant form. There were many beings and weapons there that could harm this fiery vessel of hers, but the damage they dealt would be instantly healed at the cost of her essence. The form of the spirit of light was a manifestation of her incandescent soul, and so, one would have to extinguish her soul completely to destroy it. Which was not impossible, especially when facing enemies of higher ranks. The ancient stone wraiths she was fighting were among such enemies. You have slain a great beast, Usura of condemnation. Your soul shines brighter. You have slain a great beast, Usura of condemnation. Your soul shines brighter. You have slain a great beast. Nephis managed to bring down 3 of the 7 nightmare creatures in quick succession, but after that, the situation worsened. The abominable golems witnessed her power and grasped it, their movements changing as a result. They were of the great rank, after all. For creatures like these, the distinction between flesh and flame was of no importance. The strange diamond weapons they wielded carried their killing will, and before that will, all would be annihilated. The laws of the world themselves bent to accommodate it. If she was struck by one of the Usuras, her soul would not collapse from a single blow, but the damage would be considerable. Even for a great beast, destroying a transcendent titan would not be easy, but there were a lot of these creatures here, so she had to be careful. Nephis gave up on offense and evaded the thunderous attacks of the menacing golems, biding her time until the Lord of Shadows returned. She had not waited for long. On the 7th second after his departure, the shadow demon shot out of the darkness on the border of the burning clearing, his great Odachi plummeting onto one of the Asuras a split second later, like the edge of nightfall. Now there were two of them facing four great beasts. Nephis and the Lord of Shadows glanced at each other briefly. Her radiant, graceful silhouette contrasted starkly against his towering, tenebrous figure. Then they exploded with motion. I wonder. Nephis was concerned for a split second. Her partial transformation was less destructive than the full one, but it still generated terrible heat. The stone armor of the ancient golems withstood it easily, but what about the Lord of Shadows? Very few people were strong enough to fight side by side with her when she went all out. However, she didn't have to worry. The onyx carapace of the shadow demon glistened darkly, reflecting the furious white radiance of her flame, but held. That fearsome armor, it seemed, was of a better quality than her own, or at least possessed a very high resistance to elemental attacks. In any case, he did not seem to have any trouble plunging into the middle of the burning clearing, seemingly unperturbed by the blinding light, scorching heat, and lack of oxygen. His movements were just as swift, ferocious, and sharp as they had been before. That's a relief, then. Her spirits were uplifted. Nephis and the Lord of Shadows clashed with the four Asuras, the surrounding jungle swiftly turning into a wasteland of splinters and ash. The black sword she had wielded had been long obliterated by flames, so Nephis used her stunning speed and agility to fight the abominations with bare hands. She was swift and much smaller than the towering golems, her technique fluid and flawless. The diamond weapons flashed past, never managing to touch her radiant vessel. However, Nephis herself wasn't able to attack as brazenly as before, either. Using her sublime grasp of the essence of combat, she delivered a constant stream of shallow attacks to her enemies. The stone armor on their wrists, ankles, and joints was gradually melting, slowing the abominations down. The Lord of Shadows, meanwhile, was a much easier target. Not only was his dark body broad and towering, but he was also slower than her, his terrifying Odachi demanding a lot more space to be wielded effectively. And yet, somehow, none of the attacks of the Asuras managed to land on his onyx armor. His technique was just as sublime as hers, but it was also strange. Sometimes his movements did not seem too swift compared to her, at least, but at other times it was as if he was so fast as to leave afterimages behind him. No, not even that. It was as if the Lord of Shadows was sometimes in two places at the same time. It took Nephis a few moments to understand what was happening. Transcendent battle art. His spatial movement ability was intricately woven into his battle style. The Lord of Shadows masterfully used short-distance teleportation to maneuver around the battlefield, blinking from place to place with such speed that it seemed as if he was in several places simultaneously. The graceful movements of his sword flowed uninterrupted between the jumps, so a slash that started in one spot could land dozens of meters away. An enemy attack could be blocked despite him being nowhere near its path. In a sense, the whole battlefield was within the reach of his serpentine Odachi. There was also another detail. He's jumping between shadows. After noticing that detail, Nephis also realized with a bit of surprise that the Lord of Shadows was anticipating and making use of her own movements. Currently, she was the brightest source of light on the battlefield, so the direction of the shadows cast by the massive bodies of the Asuras was dictated by her position. The Lord of Shadows was paying attention to her movements to anticipate the movement of the shadows, and was therefore able to escape the danger freely, unfailingly appearing behind the abominations to deliver a terrible strike and dissolve into the darkness before they could retaliate. It was an utterly beautiful display of flawless technique, firm intent, and devious ingenuity. Diabolical. Nephis was impressed. Dodging the crushing blow of a diamond staff, she floated into the air to avoid being thrown off balance by the quaking earth, and shot forward. Her incandescent palm touched the elbow of the ancient golem, and its elbow joint finally cracked, falling apart in a rain of molten stone. Now that the enemy was unable to wield the heavy staff effectively, she had a window of opportunity. Landing lightly on the burning ground, Nephi spun and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to the towering abomination. Her long, slender leg connected to its abdomen, and the Usra was thrown back, its entire torso exploding and catching fire. By the time the burning golem fell to the ground, it was already dead. But just as it died, more Usras appeared from the depths of the ruin, lunging at Nephis and her battle partner with silent malice. Nephis and the Lord of Shadow had slain the initial 4 great beasts, but by then, there were already more of the fearsome Usras that had risen from the ruins and reached them, surrounding the two like a fatal tide of ancient stone and sinister, evil will. She was coming closer and closer to the cusp of fatigue. The Lord of Shadows, meanwhile, seemed to be holding back on using his teleportation ability. He must have told the truth when saying that carrying the 2 sleepers all the way to the citadel and coming back would put a strain on his reserves of essence. It had to be conserved now. Luckily, their goal was not to obliterate all the ancient wraiths. Their goal was simply to escape. Granted, there was some bad luck involved, too. The easiest route of retreat would have been to escape to the surface through the nearest crack in the dome of the colossal breastbone. But the veil of clouds was torn right now, and the surface was bathed in the light of the annihilating sun. That path was not an option. Nevertheless, Nephis wasn't too concerned. She was still holding back the most destructive of her powers. She had no doubt that the Lord of Shadows had a few tricks up his sleeve, as well. And yet, what was that cold, heavy weight pressing down on her heart? Move back. His voice was just as cold as ever. She didn't hesitate and pushed the ground with her foot, leaving a scorched mark on it and flying more than 100 meters back almost in an instant. In the next second, a small lantern of black stone appeared in one of the shadow demon's 4 hands. His onyx armor shifted and retreated under his obsidian skin, revealing his powerful physique. Left alone, the Lord of Shadow lingered for a moment, seemingly unable to evade the attacks of the abominable golems in time. Everything that followed happened in a split second. Their diamond weapons landed on his muscular body, mangling it gruesomely. A tide of darkness suddenly flowed out of the stone lantern and came alive, enveloping the advancing Usras with 1,000 black chains. Even though the great beasts tore the chains apart with ease, they were still stalled for several precious moments. In those moments, the broken, savaged body of the Lord of Shadows swayed slowly and dissolved into nothingness. Neff's radiant eyes flashed. "Hey!" But then a familiar human figure stepped out of the shadows by her side, the onyx helmet closing to hide his face, completely unharmed. She let out a silent sigh of relief. "I suggest we hurry and get away, Lady Nephis." Utter indifference. Well, to be fair, her face was also motionless and impassive, not that he could see her features in the torrent of brilliant light. It's good that he's alive. Was it good, though? If the Lord of Shadows perished, his citadel would be hers to take. Bringing such a precious gift to the King of Swords would further her goals greatly. And yet Nephis was happy that he was unharmed. Using the momentary delay of the sinister Usras, the 2 of them made a hasty retreat. They ran through the ancient ruins, getting closer to the border. The golems gave chase and were gaining on them slowly, not as slowly as Nephis would have hoped, but enough so to give them a chance to escape into the jungle. There were still a few of the ancient golems stalking the ruin, though. One of them barred their path, prompting Nephis and the Lord of Shadows to perform a flawless pincer attack without exchanging a single word. His black Odachi fell, Her radiant hand flew. The ghastly nightmare creature crumbled to the ground. "You have slain a great beast, Usura of condemnation." The rest of the abominations were right behind them, but the edge of the ruins was already close. Nephi's could already see the remains of an ancient wall, overgrown with red moss and twisting vines. But the cold feeling grasping her fiery heart only grew stronger. She frowned. A saint's intuition was more than an unreliable gut feeling. Transcendent beings were greatly attuned to the world and could sense subtle changes in it. The flow of spirit essence, the movements of the underlying laws, the changes in the fabric of reality. Something was very wrong. What is that? Both Nephi's and the Lord of Shadows halted, realizing almost at the same time that the edge of the ancient ruins was somehow getting further away. No matter how fast they ran, the distance between them and the overgrown wall did not diminish. They glanced at each other somberly. In the next moment, the entire world quaked violently, and something massive moved behind them. Turning around, Nephi saw the ground at the heart of the ancient city moving, rising above the jungle like a mountain. Countless trees toppled and fell down, the sea of vines and bushes drowning in the rolling soil. The ancient structures were revealed from underneath the carpet of red moss, only to crumble moments later. It was as though something colossal had been sleeping under the ancient jungle, and was now rising from below, its slumber disturbed by the incinerating heat of the white flames and the clamor of fierce battle. She suddenly felt horror. Horror was not something Nephi's felt often, and definitely not on her own accord. The only reason for that feeling was that her mind was being affected by an external force. Neph's flames dimmed a little when a dire realization surfaced in her mind. Her lips parted, and she whispered a single word. Condemnation. The great beasts they had been battling were called the Usuras of condemnation. She had thought that they were simply a swarm of nightmare creatures populating the ancient ruin, their name hinting at some forgotten mystery of the past. But now, Nephi's realized that it had a much more literal meaning. As the mountain of raised soil started to split open, revealing the appearance of the being that had been buried underneath, she thought that her horror had been quite an appropriate reaction. The Usuras of condemnation were not a natural swarm of great beasts bound to a single location. Instead, they were here together for another, much more sinister reason. They were the minions of a much more powerful being. Their names simply pointed at whom they belonged to. Their master had to be of a higher rank, after all. The cursed tyrant, condemnation. A cursed tyrant. Nephi's felt an unfamiliar emotion that she couldn't quite describe, awe perhaps, or maybe hatred. The pure flames of her soul roared, surging restlessly in the presence of the harrowing adversary. Cursed nightmare creatures were the epitome of terror. Each of them was equal to what a sacred being would have been, not that there were any of those around. Nevertheless, sacred beings held a special meaning for humanity. That was because of what the steps of the path of ascension meant, at least as far as humans theorized. If the path of ascension was the road to divinity, then each step brought those treading it closer to godhood. Transcendence was the step of breaking away from the limits of the mundane. Supremacy was the act of asserting one's power over the world, thus establishing the foundation of their future apotheosis. But it was the next step, which no awakened of their world had taken before, that signified truly attaining the qualities of the divine. A sacred being was already a deity, albeit a lesser one. The same could be said about a cursed being. The cursed tyrant, condemnation, could very well be called a deity, a profane deity of abyssal corruption. And so, in a sense, today was the first time Nephi's would face a god in battle. But not the last. Time seemed to slow down as condemnation rose from beneath the ruins. The gargantuan shape of the ancient fiend was still hidden behind the layers of collapsing soil and crumbling buildings, but it was already like a towering mountain. The quaking earth, the scale of it all, seemed more like a natural process than the movements of a living being. Or rather, unnatural. Witnessing the sleeping giant wake from its slumber, Nephi's could finally guess how this ancient city had been destroyed, and why it had fallen despite the dire might of its defenders. The warriors that wielded the dreadful power of the sorcerous exosuits and the sublime diamond weapons, the Usuras, had perished when the cursed tyrant descended upon their city like a cataclysm. Even their impossible strength had not been enough to save this land, which was now a forgotten ruin, one of many similar ruins swallowed by the jungle. Such was the caliber of enemies the civilization of Godgrave had faced before extinction. It certainly made one wonder if the same fate awaited the civilization of the waking world, the last human civilization. America had already been lost to the advent of a Category 5 gate, Antarctica to the chain of nightmares. Humans were migrating to the dream realm now, but what would happen if a cursed tyrant was attracted by the smell of human souls and attacked Bastion, or Ravenheart? How long would the great clans last if the true horrors of the dream realm abandoned the death zones to roam its vast expanse freely? Safety was an illusion. The waking world was dying, but the dream realm was a death trap as well. Of that, Nephi's was certain. Which was why the sovereigns had to be eliminated. Not because they had killed her father, not because they had sent assassins after her and turned her childhood into a cruel nightmare, not because they had brought the immortal Flame clan to ruin, although Nephi's would lie if she said that none of that mattered. It was not even because of the countless lives lost because of their schemes in Antarctica. The reason was that the sovereigns were not up to the task. They were incompetent, strangling humanity's power in pursuit of misguided reasons. Kai Song, Anvil, Asterion, none of the three was wise enough, determined enough, and desperate enough. Their achievements were great, and they might have thought that their cynical tyranny was for the greater good. But they were not someone who could defeat the nightmare spell. That said, to have a chance to defeat them and bring about change, Nephi's had to survive the meeting with this cursed tyrant first. She gritted her teeth. There is no escape. A cursed tyrant was like a deity, and a deity could exert great power upon the world. The ruins of this ancient city were condemnation's territory, and so its will here was like a law here. If it didn't want to let the two saints leave, they wouldn't be able to leave. Nephi's and the Lord of Shadows had already witnessed how space itself was preventing them from escaping into the jungle. What other option was there? If they couldn't escape, they had to fight. But defeating a cursed tyrant in battle was not something either of them was capable of. Even surviving a single attack by the profane being was questionable. The gap was too great. Nephi's glanced at the Lord of Shadows and asked, her clear voice resounding in the roar of the quaking earth. That spatial ability of yours, can you escape? He shook his head. Not this time. Not this time. It sounded as if this was not his first time encountering a cursed nightmare creature. Just what kind of life had he led? Nephi's took a deep breath. Or rather, she mimicked the familiar motions of taking a deep breath. The radiant spirit did not have lungs after all, and neither needed nor was capable of breathing. It was simply a vessel containing a vast ocean of flame. She had been prepared to unleash her full transformation if things went south. However, the current situation was way worse than even her worst prediction. Even if she did allow the spirit form to dissolve, releasing the ocean of flame contained within its brilliant figure, she wouldn't be able to contend against the cursed tyrant. No other choice then. Well, it couldn't be helped. She had managed to come closer than usual to fully saturating her soul cores this time around already. The important part was to make the sacrifice count. Watching a vague figure reveal itself from beneath the mountain of flowing soil, Nephi's glanced at the approaching Usuras and said evenly, "Hold back these creatures, then. I'll create an opportunity for the two of us to escape." Surrounded by radiant light, Nephi's concentrated for a moment and reached into her incandescent soul. They could not escape, but they also could not fight the cursed tyrant. In that situation, the only way out Nephi saw was to create a momentary lapse in the tyrant's concentration. It was the abomination's profane will that was preventing them from reaching the jungle. If that will was weakened, even for a few moments, a path to freedom would be theirs to take. Nephi's had no hope of killing the evil deity and no confidence to face it in a prolonged battle. However, she was pretty sure that she could at least hurt it. She knew pain better than most. She knew how hard it was to keep calm and steady when your body and soul were being blackened by flame, how it felt to burn alive. Anyone's will would be shaken by that agony. But her adversary this time was a cursed tyrant. Not any flame would be able to hurt it, and her usual attacks were woefully insufficient. So she had to give it her all, which required time. The Lord of Shadows had to buy her that time. As the pursuing Usuras closed in on them, he glanced at her briefly. Then he sighed and let go of his black odachi. The tenebrous sword fell to the ground, but rippled like liquid in the air. She thought that she saw a glimmer of serpentine scales. A moment later, the odachi turned into a torrent of shadows, and then coalesced into a human form, that of a woman, both her clothes and skin perfectly black, her hair like a waterfall of silken darkness. She was standing with her back to Nephi's, so her face was hidden from view. And yet, it felt like the mysterious woman was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. More than that, her presence was that of a transcendent. A moment ago, there were two saints facing the great beasts. Now there were three. Pulling another sword out of the darkness, the Lord of Shadows lunged at the ghastly Usuras without wasting any time. The black woman followed, moving with dire speed and indescribable grace. They clashed with the abominations a split second later. Sadly, Nephi's could not observe their battle. She was reaching into her soul. The blinding light emanated by her radiant figure grew even more intense, its heat more unbearable. The vines and moss covering the ruins around her turned to ash, revealing ancient stone structures. The weathered stone started to melt. "It's going to hurt." Her goal was to cause the cursed being pain, but to achieve it, she had to withstand her own share of agony. As something too harrowing to witness and too appalling to see slowly revealed itself from beneath the collapsing soil, Nephi steeled her will and ignited her soul. It was different from summoning soul flame or activating her abilities. What she was doing was a derivative skill of her aspect, something she had always been capable of, but only truly learned how to do in twilight. Instead of merely burning soul essence, she was burning her very soul. But unlike the crude way she had done so in twilight, Nephi's was doing it in a much more refined and controlled manner now. With each moment, her soul cores grew weaker, and her counter of soul fragments plummeted with dire speed. Each soul fragment she sacrificed turned into a torrent of immolating flame. That incandescent inferno grew and grew, the terrifying power contained within it reaching a truly chilling scale. Nephi's could detonate a soul core to produce a tremendous explosion, but an explosion was a wild thing. It spread in all directions, annihilating everything in its path. Such a calamity could obliterate a vast number of enemies, both weak and strong. To deal a wound to someone as strong as a cursed tyrant, however, such a dispersed tool of destruction was suited poorly. She needed something much more concentrated, targeted, and controlled. Consumed by a harrowing agony, Nephi's endured the feeling of her soul being burned to ash, and slowly raised a radiant hand. In front of her, The Lord of Shadows and the mysterious saint he had summoned were drowning in the tide of great beasts. She concentrated deeply and whispered several names, shaping them into a verse. Channeling that verse put a terrible strain on her mind, her burning soul, and even her brilliant vessel. The name of the fire to control the flames. The name of the wind to fan them. These two were easier. The other two. Nephis trembled as she uttered a terrible word. It was the name of destruction. The name of destruction, to greatly enhance the destructive force of her soul flame. And finally, the last one. Perhaps the most important one. She smiled darkly. The condemnation. The true name of the cursed deity, the hint to which had been so generously provided to her by the spell. To bind the devastating flame to the ancient fiend, and bind the fiend to the flame. Names were a powerful thing. And so Nephis called flame and destruction upon the tyrant, using her own soul as fuel. In the next moment, a perfectly white ray of concentrated flame shot off her palm, connecting it to the terrible shape of the rising giant many kilometers away. Its arrival was instantaneous. Its passing burned the world itself, leaving a scar on it. Even though it consisted of flame, it seemed like a ray of pure white light. That light bit into the flesh of condemnation, slicing it apart like a sharp blade. Terrible burns were left in its wake. And just as Nephis was drowning in terrible agony, the cursed tyrant convulsed, its mind pierced by unbearable pain. An indescribable, deafening, harrowing sound shook the world. It was a sound that would drive a mundane person, no, even an awakened, a master, a weaker saint, mad from simply hearing it. Condemnation was screaming. Run! Nephis swayed, her radiance dimming. Her transformation was dismissed, and she once again turned into a human. The white tunic she had been wearing was singed and burned, barely holding in place. Right, I should summon the rest of my armor. But she was momentarily dazed, paying the price for burning away a part of her soul. Nephis had told the Lord of Shadows to run, but found herself unable to follow her own advice. Before she could do anything, though, two strong arms grabbed her. Raising her unceremoniously, he dashed away without saying a word. The onyx surface of his armor was smooth and cool to the touch. Am I being carried? She was stunned. When had something like that ever happened to her? Grab a hold of yourself, princess. Despite the situation, his voice sounded as cold and arrogant as always, maybe even a little colder than usual. She closed her eyes for a moment, then summoned the rest of her armor. By the time it weaved itself from sparks of light, the Lord of Shadows let go of her, and they ran toward the edge of the ruins together. The echoes of the cursed tyrant's pained howl were still traveling across the hollows when they escaped into the jungle, leaving the forgotten city behind. Just like that, their one-on-one expedition into the hollows was over. A few hours later, Nephis was sitting on the steps of the nameless temple. The world was mercilessly stark, black and white, with no place left for feeling or compromise. As it always happened after she overused her aspect, her emotions were dampened and weak, almost gone. Her heart was cold. Or maybe it was so impossibly scorching that it felt cold. She was tired but couldn't feel the tiredness. One could not remember pain, but remembering having suffered pain was all too easy. Raising a hand, she allowed a soft radiance to ignite under her skin and stared at it silently. It still hurts. Good, that was good. Nephis knew that she had not truly lost herself as long as she could still feel the pain and fear it. She sighed. It was time to return. The fire-keepers had already gathered in front of her, ready to depart. The three sleepers were also there, looking around with awe and amazement. Even Tamar, the legacy girl, was subdued by the solemn atmosphere of the dark temple. The master of the temple, meanwhile, had not come to see them off. Only his echo was watching. The Lord of Shadows. Such a mysterious man. Nephis tilted her head a little, remembering how he behaved in the forgotten ruin, not during the battle but before it. Surprisingly enough, the cold warrior seemed to have a lot of interest in history, almost like an explorer. That was a side of him she had not seen before. Which was understandable, considering that they didn't know each other too well. However, at that moment, her indifferent eyes glinted slightly. She thought back to their first meeting, when he challenged her to a duel. The style he used once belonged to her family. Naturally, Nephis had asked the Lord of Shadows who taught that style to him. And what had he answered? Her lips parted. And nobody. Boss, are you okay? Aiko's voice sounded a bit confused as she glanced at Sunny with a dubious expression. The petite girl was floating near the ceiling, taking inventory of their liquor shelf. He, meanwhile, was busy cooking and cursing under his breath. There were a lot of customers today, but Sunny could not even manifest an avatar to keep up with the flood of orders. That third guy, selfish bastard. He gritted his teeth. Where did all my essence go? The gloomy shadow, left to its devices for once, was staring at him mockingly. Sunny glared at it back. What? I know we're the same person. It's a figure of speech, okay? The phrase, you have no one to blame but yourself, had never been so poignant. The last few days had not been easy on Sunny. And it was all because of his third avatar. First, there was the problem with Weaver's mask. He had intended for the Lord of Shadow to wear it at all times, but in practice, it made having any kind of sensible conversation impossible. Well, not impossible maybe, but definitely way too frustrating. So, Sunny had been busy crafting a special memory for the third avatar ever since, returning from the mirror maze beneath Bastion. He could not really reproduce the mantle of lies. Weaver's mask was a divine memory, after all, so making a copy of even a single enchantment was utterly beyond his ability. He could create a knockoff Weaver's mask, though, by using an alteration of the nebulous mantle's enchantments. He had even added a bit of the autumn leaf, one of the memories he had lost, into the mix. As a result, the Lord of Shadows could still remain a mystery. His voice, height, hair color, and mystical traits were either hidden or distorted. Of course, he was not immune to all forms of divination unless the real Weaver's mask was summoned. But since Cassie already knew the truth and had agreed to hide it, there was no need for such a level of secrecy. For now, at least. Until the forces of the great clans arrived at Godgrave. In any case, creating this memory, which Sunny lazily named Definitely Not Me, had kept him awake for a few nights. It was imperative that he created it, though. Awakened with affinity to shadows were already very rare, and if the humble shopkeeper in Bastion was discovered, to not only share this rare trait with the mysterious Lord of Shadows, but also have similar height and build as the mysterious saint, his peaceful life would be over. Pulling a few all-nighters was a bit of a chore, but he could manage it. But then he had to go and waste an ocean of essence in Godgrave as well. Traversing the hollows and fighting great beasts was already bad enough. But then, Sunny decided to transport the two sleepers back all by himself. The ruins of the Forgotten City were situated in the vicinity of the Nameless Temple, but only relative to the overall size of the region. In truth, there was close to 200 kilometers between them. It was well within his power to make 3 or 4 consecutive jumps while carrying 2 dormant humans, and then come back the same way. The essence cost of such travel was very high, though, draining his reserves to a dangerous degree. So now, Sunny felt rather helpless. He couldn't even allow himself to manifest an additional avatar, let alone do something more strenuous. Whatever essence he had left had to be preserved in case there was an emergency. It was a good thing that Nephis had left Godgrave with the Fire Keepers. Gods knew He wouldn't want her to see him in such a pathetic state. So Sunny had no choice but to suffer and curse silently. Ready, send it to the seventh table. Aiko used her telekinesis to send a beautifully plated dish into the dining hall, and he finally had a minute to rest. Sunny sighed, took a sip of water from the endless spring, and frowned slightly. Sunny! Cassie's voice suddenly resounded in his head, creeping him out. He was still not used to that. But at the same time, it strangely felt too familiar. Yes, Saint Cassia. A moment later, her soft voice resounded again. About the Memory Commission. I'll send someone to your shop today to explain the details. He raised an eyebrow. She was already whispering into his ear, figuratively speaking. Was there really a need to send someone? Couldn't she just explain what she wanted straight away? Maybe Cassie was conserving essence too. He shrugged. All right, is there anything else? Sorry, I'm a bit busy, lots of customers today. She remained silent for a moment. There is nothing else. Well, actually, I do have something to say. Sunny's expression darkened. What was going on? Had she received a vision and wanted to hint at something? That couldn't be right. Hadn't Cassie told him that the future could not be seen clearly anymore? He looked down. I'm all ears. Strangely enough, she lingered for a while this time. Eventually, though, her voice rustled in his mind once more. It's nothing important, really. Just a little piece of advice in the future. You might want to avoid using words like heavy and burden when speaking to women. Just thought I would share. His eye twitched. Cassie's tone was polite and serious, but he couldn't help but feel that she was suppressing laughter. Sunny cleared his throat. Oh, that's funny. Almost as funny as the fact that I've lived peacefully on my own, but just a couple of days after the woman in question showed up on my doorstep, there was suddenly a cursed tyrant trying to gobble me up. A person with less decorum than me could call that a bit burdensome, don't you think? There was no answer. He waited for a while, then took a deep breath. Damnation! Sunny was slowly starting to realize what the most terrible thing about Cassie's ability was not that she could spy on almost anyone undetected. It was that she was the one in control of who had the last word. Muttering under his breath, he returned to cooking. The day passed in a blur. Sunny was so busy that he had not sat down once until the evening, which, in theory, was a good thing. Why would he complain about how popular his restaurant was becoming? Cassie's commission was bound to be very profitable for the brilliant emporium as well. It was just that working hard and working hard, while also working hard in two other places, were two entirely different things. As the sun rolled behind the horizon and the crescent moon appeared in the velvet sky, the dining hall of the brilliant emporium became deserted. Aiko had left, leaving Sunny to close down on his own. He was carrying a tray of dirty dishes to the kitchen when someone approached the door. Must be the person Cassie sent. He turned to the door, waiting for the person to enter. When the silver bell rang, though, Sunny suddenly tripped and fell on his face. The dishes rolled on the floor. What is she doing here? Laying on the floor, he cautiously looked up. Long legs, slender waist, a light summer dress, alabaster skin. The silky hair was black, but it was hardly enough to disguise her. Sunny's eyes widened. The person Cassie promised to send is Nephis. Indeed, there was no mistake. Nephis, who had just left the nameless temple yesterday, was now somehow here, in the brilliant emporium. Looking down at him in confusion. She hesitated for a moment, and then asked in a polite tone, Master Sunless, I've been told that you can create powerful memories. For Nephis, the world was still stark and sharp, devoid of subtlety. Her emotions were still subdued and mostly missing. It had not been long since the battle with condemnation, if their desperate escape could even be called a battle, and so She had not recovered from the annihilating pain of burning her soul to ash yet. She had been in Godgrave just yesterday. Back then, they had waited on the steps of the nameless temple for a long time for its master to come and take them back to the waking world. Nephise could have carried her warriors across the threshold of realms herself, but the tentative agreement with the Lord of Shadows was preventing her from placing a tether in the vicinity of his citadel. In the end, the mysterious saint walked out of the darkness and silently brought the fire keepers, the three sleepers and herself away from the dream realm, one at a time. She suspected that he could carry more than one person across realms. Nephise herself could carry 7 other saints, or more than 100 mundane people. But Shadow kept his secrets close to his chest, as always. She had been idly curious where his tether in the waking world would be. Saints usually had an established base there, most within the well-guarded walls of their clan's compound. Nephise herself, as well as the fire keepers, operated from the former manor of the Immortal Flame clan. It was a bit of a contentious topic, actually, because the Elders of Valor wanted them to reside within the great clan's stronghold in NQSC, officially, for safety reasons, but truthfully to control them better. But the relationship between the fire keepers and the rest of Valor forces was generally a bit awkward, not the least because of the 6 months the survivors of the Forgotten Shore had spent hiding in the Dream Realm to avoid the fallout of Cassie's conflict with the Great Clan. It had only been resolved after Nephise returned and agreed to become Anvil's adopted daughter. In any case, there were no independent saints, really. Everyone either had a legacy clan supporting them or worked for the government. So, Nephise was understandably curious about where the Lord of Shadows tethered himself in the waking world. Was it a secret compound in NQSC, an unassuming residential building, a stronghold of a minor legacy clan in one of the other quadrants, the remains of an abandoned government facility, perhaps? She had idly imagined all kinds of places, thinking that they might hint to his real background. Curiously enough, though, the tether of the Lord of Shadows was carelessly placed in the middle of an empty street in the outskirts of NQSC. The outskirts were much more desolate now than they had been before, with many people having left for the Dream Realm. There were many abandoned areas like this one, where there was hardly any foot traffic. While unconventional, the placement of the tether seemed to be dictated by nothing except for pure convenience, which had not told her anything at all. Nephise had been the last one to be brought over. The Lord of Shadows did not waste any time on saying goodbyes, nodding at her curtly before dissolving into the darkness. Just like that, her expedition to Godgrave was over. There were a lot of things she had to do after that. Nephise visited the 3 sleepers at the academy to check on them. Since they had never managed to anchor themselves in the dream realm, they would have to request the help of a saint, pass through one of the dream gates, or wait for the next winter solstice to complete their awakening. She would have offered her help, but considering Tamer's allegiance to the Song domain, having her anchor in Bastion was not an option. After that, the fire keepers either returned to the Immortal Flame Manor or went straight back to the Ivory Tower. They needed some rest. As for Nephise herself, she made her way to the compound of Clan Valor. Then, it was a whirlwind of briefings and reports, as well as a lot of waiting. Luckily, Cassie was there to help her manage the most tedious parts. It was not until the morning of the next day that Nephise had a chance to rest and recover. She ate a late breakfast, took a long shower, and put on some mundane clothes, going through the motions. It was a bit annoying. Everything not having to do with furthering her goal was, in her current state. Eventually, she ended up making an appointment with her therapist. Nephise had been assigned a psychological counselor after returning from her second nightmare, and was seeing one periodically to this day. Of course, it was a bit of a farcical affair. She believed that there was some benefit to receiving counseling. Gods knew, her mental state was far from untroubled. It had been especially bad after the second nightmare, and would turn cold and emotionless every time she overused her aspect. Nephi's was concerned about losing the sight of her humanity, which was the reason she had agreed to therapy. However, it wasn't hard to guess that her assigned therapist was making regular reports about everything she said during their sessions. At first, the reports had gone to the government. After Nephi's joined Clan Valor, her initial counselor was suddenly unavailable and referred her to a colleague. The new counselor was unmistakably making detailed reports to the elders of the great clan. So it was a charade. Nephi's pretended not to know and continued to visit the therapist to nurture the feeling of false control Clan Valor had regarding her. That said, even a charade could be useful sometimes. There were many useful things she had learned from the counselors, while they were learning falsehood from her. For example, the act of wearing mundane clothes. Nephi's would have been comfortable never dismissing her armor memories, but it was these small acts of human behavior that tethered her to humanity. She was also often encouraged to participate in mundane leisure activities and communicate with ordinary people more. There were other small things she had learned to do as well. Nephi's found these tasks a bit tedious, but beneficial to the state of her soul. It was also good to her current endeavor of mastering the knowledge of passion. She tended to spend all her time in the company of a certain kind of people, awakened warriors and elite ones at that. Their passions burned bright, but were usually colored with similar hues. Experiencing a wide range of human hopes and aspirations was bound to help her understand that elusive branch of her aspect legacy better. And so Nephi's listened to her counselor well, which was why she arrived at the quaint cafe in a remote part of Bastion feeling very uncomfortable in a light summer dress. It was winter in NQSC, but here in Bastion, the weather was warm and mild. Nephi's did not receive a lot of opportunities to take a leisurely stroll around town, but she remembered enjoying the thriving atmosphere of the swiftly developing city during her last outing, which was about a year ago now. The city sprawling around the beautiful lake had changed tremendously since then. Of course, Nephi's was familiar with all these changes. She gazed down upon the bustling streets of Bastion, often from the tranquil height of her heavenly island, studying the lively flow of human activity from a distance. Every time the ivory tower returned here, the city seemed different. The humans, however, were the same. Sadly, Nephi's did not enjoy diving into their liveliness today. She was still recovering from the battle with condemnation, after all. Her stroll was not entirely for leisure, either. She had left the castle with a specific purpose in mind. Nephi's had long been searching for a talented enchanter. She and the firekeepers received plenty of memories by slaying nightmare creatures, sure, but those memories were too dependent on the whims of the spell. Very few of them suited her needs perfectly, or were powerful enough to make a difference. That was where awakened enchanters could help. The problem was that craftsmen capable of forging memories, or even enchanted items, were extremely rare. Most of them belonged to the Valor family, and while Nephi's could easily commission a memory from her own clan that would defeat the purpose. It was precisely because her most powerful memories were either known to or directly created by the great clan Valor that she was searching for an independent enchanter in secret. Yesterday, Cassie informed her that their search had finally borne fruit. Not only that, but the person in question resided right here, in Bastion, and as a cherry on top, he even happened to possess an extremely rare affinity to shadows. The last part was of no importance for the commission, but given the sudden entrance of the Lord of Shadows on the stage, Nephi's was curious to learn more about this unusual element and its nuances. Therefore, Cassie had decisively sent her to meet the enchanter personally. Nephi's was not sure why she had to go herself, but since Cassie assured her that this person could be trusted to keep a secret, She arrived at the place late in the evening, knowing her friend. The man would have passed an extensive background check, so there was no reason not to. That said, it wasn't easy for Nephis to walk freely on the streets of Bastion. Her fame was too great to remain unrecognized. So she used several cosmetic memories to slightly alter her appearance. Even then, she had only ventured out after it was already dark. Reaching the quiet Lakeshore Street, she glanced at the cozy brick cottage, and then at the sign hanging above the door. Sunny's Brilliant Emporium, Cafe and Memory Boutique. For a moment, Nephis tried to imagine what it would have felt like to live in a simple cottage like that and make a living by doing peaceful things, away from the bloodshed and stench of the battlefield. All of it seemed so alien. And yet, that was exactly how this humble enchanter and most people in the world lived. This peaceful life was what she was trying not to lose sight of. Well, the peaceful part was true, but very few people lived in a cottage quite as unique as this one. Cassie had warned her that it was a strange kind of echo. Otherwise, there was a risk that Nephis would misunderstand things and accidentally burn it to the ground. Nephis took a deep breath, prepared herself mentally for the awkward feeling of meeting an unfamiliar person, and walked inside. A moment later, there was the sound of plates scattering on the floor. She froze, looking down in confusion. The enchanter was sprawled on the floor, staring at her with a stunned expression. He seemed to be a very clumsy person to have tripped on his own feet like that. No coordination whatsoever. A person like that would definitely not last long on the battlefield, which was fine. Not everyone was born for combat. They stared at each other silently for a few moments, and then the young man jumped to his feet, dusting off his clothes in embarrassment. Having done so, he smiled at her as if nothing had happened. "Welcome to the Brilliant Emporium." Nephis was momentarily stumped. When Cassie had told her about a talented master capable of forging powerful memories, she had imagined an older man, sharp and austere, like most smiths of valor were. What she had not expected was that the shopkeeper would be so young, delicate, and good-looking. Nephis was used to being in the company of extremely attractive people, of course, and yet the proprietor of the Brilliant Emporium stood out even among them, most saints included. He was not very tall, with a slender build and delicate features. His skin was smooth and white, like flawless marble, while his onyx eyes were like darkly glistening gems. His raven-black hair was carelessly gathered in a knot, and there was a subtle sense of calm confidence to him, one that seemed understated but almost demanded attention. He was like an elegant porcelain doll dressed in fine black silk. This softer kind of beauty of his was so unlike the rugged handsomeness of the seasoned warriors Nephis usually encountered. More than that, the young man entirely lacked presence, the mystical kind, hinting that he wasn't very powerful a master. Which made sense. Not every awakened was a warrior, and after Antarctica, there were even plenty of masters who had ascended out of necessity, not choice. Someone with a utility aspect did not have to wield a sword, and many lived without experiencing much strife or violence, or even none whatsoever. No matter how distant and strange such a life seemed to Nephis. Cassie did not tell me. She suddenly realized that she had been silent for too long. Keeping her face expressionless, Nephis spoke. "Ah yes, Master Sunless, I presume Saint Cassia sent me." The enchanter looked at her strangely, hesitated for a moment, and then said politely, "Indeed, I am called Master Sunless. Please forgive me, Lady Nephis. Saint Cassia did not warn me." Nephis nodded. "Yes, she didn't warn me either." He blinked. "Sorry." She cleared her throat and looked away in embarrassment. "No, nothing. I am here to talk about a memory. I think I might kill Cassie." Sonny kept a smile on his face to hide how startled and rattled he was. It may have looked a bit sheepish, and he may have looked like a bit of a clown, but there was nothing he could do about that. It already took a titanic effort for Sonny not to glance at the dirty dishes scattered on the floor, or summon a swarm of shadows to quickly clean them away. Keep calm. Nephi's was here, in the brilliant emporium, looking at him with a strange expression. Well, of course her expression was strange. He had just made a fool out of himself right in front of her, and that was technically their first meeting, no less, which started with him planting on his face. Sonny wanted to fall through the floor. Actually, that might be possible. It would not take a lot for the marvelous mimic to swallow him into the basement. Struggling to throw these thoughts out of his head, Sonny asked in as polite of tone as he could manage, given the circumstances. Indeed, I am called Master Sunless. Please forgive me, Lady Nephi's. St. Cassia did not warn me. Not only was Nephi's here, but she was also wearing a dress. A dress? That should have been categorized as a crime. Her light dress was simple and white, with not much decoration. It covered her shoulders and had a modest neckline, the hem resting somewhat high above her knees. Nevertheless, the modesty of the dress only served to accentuate the graceful line of her slender body, and the stark contrast between her alabaster skin and black hair only made her gray eyes look more striking. Suddenly, Sonny was thankful that it was already dark outside. Otherwise, Neff's appearance might have caused the brilliant emporium to be besieged by a mob of admirers. And then he would have had to hold himself back from minting a fresh batch of soul coins. Suddenly, he realized that Nephi's had said something. He had no idea what. Sonny blinked. Sorry. She cleared her throat, then looked away, perhaps in displeasure at his lack of manners and mental faculties. No, nothing. I am here to talk about a memory. Sonny forced out another smile, then gestured to one of the tables. Please take a seat. I will be with you shortly. He pulled out a chair for her, then swiftly picked up the scattered plates and escaped into the kitchen. Before going in, though, Sonny hesitated for a moment. Would you like something to drink? We just received a fresh batch of coffee beans and tea. She shook her head. Water is fine. He nodded and entered the kitchen. A moment later, Sonny leaned against the wall and breathed heavily. What the hell? He had been anticipating meeting Nephi's for a long time, so he was mentally prepared to face her, but the one meant to face her was the Lord of Shadows, not him, the humble and unassuming shopkeeper. There was no reason whatsoever for someone as exalted as Changing Star of the Immortal Flame clan to visit the brilliant emporium, so Sonny had never once imagined that she would. Calm down. Sonny took a deep breath, then quietly checked to see if the nebulous mantle was working. Everything was fine. His presence was hidden, and his facade of a harmless artisan was sufficiently maintained. In fact, this year of living peacefully in Bastion had smoothed out his edges, so this incarnation of his looked somewhat gentle. There was no way someone would associate the innocuous owner of the brilliant emporium with the antisocial, menacing Lord of Shadows. I'm good. Still, what the hell was Cassie thinking about? St. Cassia, what the hell? As he poured water from the endless spring into a glass, she answered pleasantly. What do you mean? The glass almost exploded in Sonny's hand. Why is Changing Star here? He could just imagine the blind seer laughing somewhere across the lake, in the castle. Why wouldn't she be there? The memory I wanted to commission is for her. She is the best person to explain what she needs. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, not knowing how to answer. What have you told her about me? Cassie's voice resounded in his head, calm and steady. That you can forge powerful memories, can be trusted to keep a secret, and have an affinity to shadows. The last part was a bit problematic, but after thinking about it for a moment, Sunny had to admit that it was for the best that Nephi's had been warned in advance. She would have noticed the nature of his aspect sooner or later anyway. It was better to inform her first to prevent her from getting the wrong idea. Or rather, the right idea. In any case, carrying the glass of water back, Sunny somehow found himself also carrying a small plate with a piece of cherry cake on it, as well. He had made the cake this morning to prevent the batch of Beast Farm cherries from going bad, but as to how it ended up on a plate in his hand right now, Sunny's recollection was foggy. He was suddenly full of suspicion. "You didn't erase my memories, did you?" For the first time in a while, Cassie's voice sounded confused. "Huh." He gritted his teeth. Of course, she didn't. She wouldn't have been able to in such a short amount of time, not to mention without looking him in the eyes. Never mind. It was already too late to turn back. Returning to the dining hall, he placed the glass of water and the piece of cake in front of Nephi's. She stared at the cake silently, then looked up and glanced at him. Her serious eyes were way too tantalizing. Crap. This whole situation was wrong. Why wasn't she wearing her armor? Had she destroyed her armor again? Is that why she was wearing a dress today? Was the memory she wanted to commission an armor? Then he had to finish the commission as fast as possible. On the other hand, really, it wouldn't hurt to take his time with it, would it? He wouldn't want to make anything less than flawless if it was for Nephi's. Keeping his expression neutral, Sunny sat down across from her and said with a polite smile, "You probably haven't heard that our cafe is famous for its desserts." Of course she hadn't, because it wasn't. But then again, Nephi's had made him dessert once. So it was only fair for him to return the favor, right? Nephi's was surprised to see a piece of cake in front of her. The cake was placed on a beautiful porcelain plate and even had a fresh cherry on top. It was not like she had never seen one before, but desserts weren't exactly a mainstay of her diet. Right, it's a cafe as well. She picked up a small silver spoon and tasted the cake, simply to not seem impolite. I wonder if he is really capable of forging a memory that would not lose to those created by valor. Wait. Why is it so tasty? Placing the spoon down, she looked at the handsome shopkeeper and remained silent for a moment. Eventually, Nephi said, "It seems that you have already recognized me, Master Sunless. I'll be straight, then. I need a memory forged, and a potent one at that. Saint Cassia informed me that you are a talented enchanter who is only unknown because you prefer to keep your talents hidden. I can understand why, and it even makes things easier. But are you really good enough to satisfy the needs of someone as powerful as me?" The young enchanter looked at her, a strange expression appearing on his charming face for a moment. Was he, perhaps, stumped by her question and felt insecure about his talent? Creating a memory for one of the most renowned saints in the world was not an easy task, after all. Master Sunless coughed and briefly looked away. Seeing that subtly bashful expression of his, made Nephi's understand why this cafe was so famous. Needless to say, it was probably not because of desserts. "Cassie, what the hell?" Cassie's pleasant voice resounded in her head a moment later. "What?" Nephi's kept her expression neutral. "Why is this enchanter you found so? Cassie answered innocently. "So what?" Nephi sighed. Never mind." It was a silly question anyway. She had just been startled a little. Master Sunless, meanwhile, seemed to find his confidence again and answered with a faint smile. "I can promise that you'll be satisfied, Lady Nephi's." His eyes suddenly twitched for some reason. The poor man must have been nervous. Nephi's knew that meeting her had that effect on many people. The enchanter continued in the same pleasant tone. "Let me rephrase that. What I mean to say is that the memories I create are top-notch. That said, can I ask you a question?" Nephi's wanted to answer that he could, but suddenly found herself unable to. That was because, at some point in time, another bite of the delicious cake found its way into her mouth. She didn't even notice how. It was very strange. Is my blood sugar low? Yeah, that must be it. Pulling the spoon out of her mouth slowly, she nodded with a deadpan expression. Master Sunless hesitated for a moment. You are a princess of the great clan Valor. Surely, the renowned forgemasters of your clan have no shortage of powerful memories they've created. Why come to me? Nephi shrugged, not seeing a reason to hide the truth. It is precisely because you are not a forgemaster of clan Valor. The young man seemed to have a keen mind. He understood what she meant instantly, and leaned back with a hint of amusement gleaming in the depths of his onyx eyes. I see. Master Sunless remained silent for a few moments, thinking about something. Finally, he asked, what kind of memory do you wish to commission? Nephi's answered in an even tone. A sword. She needed a sword. The one she wielded, Kinslayer, was a beautiful weapon. It was an immensely powerful weapon, as well, and one that suited her well. Nephi's had slain numerous nightmare creatures with its sharp edge, and had won countless battles while wielding it. But Anvil of Valor had branded the Kinslayer, and so it did not really belong to her anymore. She wasn't foolish enough to try cutting the King of Swords down with one of his own blades. This time, the charming enchanter remained silent for a while, studying her face with a strange intensity. Nephi's could feel his desires faintly. They were subdued, as if something was obscuring them, but she discerned a volatile mixture of hopes smoldering beautifully somewhere deep in his soul. It reminded her of the King of Swords, a little maybe because both of them were spellsmiths. It vaguely reminded her of someone else, as well. In any case, Master Sunless seemed to be sincere enough and held no malice toward her. On the contrary, he appeared to have been inspired by her, a little bit too much. Inwardly, Nephi's was surprised. Is he smitten by me? She couldn't be sure, but something like that would not be an unfamiliar situation. Being a saint meant having a strong effect on people, and it was especially true for her. That said, at least Master Sunless had enough decorum and composure to hide his feelings. They didn't seem to be of the distasteful kind, either, although there was such an element as well. Of course, there was. He's a healthy man, after all. Accustomed to such things, Nephi's did not hold it against him. In fact, she might have felt a tiny bit pleased with that reaction. It seems my soul is recovering faster this time. Feeling anything was already a good sign. Eventually, Master Sunless spoke. If that is the case, then there are 3 ways for me to make a sword for you, Lady Nephi's. She tilted her head slightly. Oh. He nodded. The first way is the most straightforward. I can take an already existing memory and alter it to fit your needs. That method is the easiest, but also the most limited. Nephi's raised an eyebrow. Cassie had not told her that Master Sunless was proficient enough to alter memories granted to Awakened by the spell, not just create his own. Even among the enchanters of Valor, that was a rare skill, in fact. She didn't know anyone except for Anvil himself who was capable of that feat. And the young enchanter called it the easiest. The charming young man, meanwhile, continued. The second way is to create a memory from scratch. That would take longer and would require me to use both suitably potent materials and soul shards of a high rank. Of course, the result would be much more lethal. Your current weapon, the Kinslayer, I am confident that I can forge something just as deadly, given enough time. Nephi's was impressed. Her sword was a transcendent memory of the 7th tier, and an exceptionally powerful one at that. Strangely enough, it was as powerful as many supreme weapons were, but of course, Master Sunless would not know that. While the name of her sword and its rank were well known, very few people had detailed information about it. It was more or less a military secret. Still, it was quite remarkable for an Ascended to be confident in creating a top-tier transcendent weapon. It seemed that he was supremely competent in his craft. Being one herself, Nephi's liked competent people. What is the third way? He smiled softly. The third way is the longest and the hardest as well. It would require a lot of effort from both of us, actually, not just from me. We will also have to spend a lot of time together, but if I succeed, the resulting memory will be truly powerful. Nephis took a sip of cold water, suddenly feeling invigorated. She lingered for a moment, then asked evenly, "How powerful exactly?" Master Sunless looked at her seriously, his smile dimming. After a short pause, he said with a hint of sober ambition in his pleasantly melodious voice, "Powerful enough to kill a god, I'd say." Understandably, Nephi seemed doubtful of Sunny's outrageous claim. She looked at him silently for a few moments, then raised an eyebrow. "But you are merely an Ascended. Forgive me for being blunt. How can an Ascended create something that powerful?" Sunny could see how she would question his ability to keep such a promise. However, he meant what he had said, because he had been thinking of a way to achieve something like that for a long, long time. He lingered for a moment, then sighed. "It's easier than you think. Not that any random Ascended would be able to, of course. But my way of creating memories is rather unique, so I can do more than most. It would be easier for me to show you. Would you mind following me?" Nephis did not move, looking at him intently. "I don't mind following Master Sunless, but not yet." He frowned a little. "Not yet." She nodded slowly, her face still and motionless. Her voice sounded even. "Yes, I." Nephis paused for a moment, then added stoically, "Haven't finished my cake yet." Sunny thought that he had heard her wrong. "What?" He blinked, but Nephis ignored his confused stare, picked up her spoon elegantly, and turned her attention to the piece of cherry cake. She ate it unhurriedly, maintaining a composed expression. He couldn't tell if she enjoyed the taste or was simply reluctant to waste food. A couple of minutes later, Nephis put her spoon down, wiped her lips with a napkin, and nodded courteously. "Thank you, how much do I owe you?" Sunny slowly shook his head. No, it's on the house." What was going on in that head of hers? They had been talking about killing gods and then paused for cake. Not that Sunny was complaining. In fact, he would have enjoyed watching her eat an entire cake instead of just a small piece, if she wanted to. 10 cakes even. Although that would be a bit costly. "Shall we go then?" He stood up and guided her to the basement of the marvelous mimic. Unlike the day he had led Tell of White Feather to retrieve the belated apology, though, Sunny headed for the back of the boutique. Nephis followed him, looking around with a hint of curiosity. He explained helpfully, "This is the memory boutique part of the brilliant emporium. As you might know, I don't advertise my ability to craft memories, so most of the customers think of me as a merchant with a wide network of connections. They peruse our inventory here or commission us to search for a memory that fits a set of custom parameters." Nephis nodded. "The interior is very tasteful. It suits you well." Huh. Sunny was not sure what she meant, but smiled in appreciation. "Thank you. Most customers only ever see the boutique, but it's actually just the front side of the business. My workshop is beyond that door over there, and beyond this door is where I keep valuable materials." As Sunny was opening the door, Nephis asked in her usual even tone, "Can I ask why you are so reluctant to reveal your talent, Master Sunless?" He lingered for a moment. "You certainly can. There are many reasons, but mainly, I just don't like the great clans. Please don't take offense, Lady Nephis." She smiled faintly. "I won't." Sunny led her into the material storage, which was a vast hall drowning in darkness, with only a few lanterns illuminating its expanse. The lanterns were there for Eiko, who sometimes assisted him in crafting. Nephi's paused at the entrance. The material storage was very different from the refined shopfront. The atmosphere here was cold and ominous, sinister, even. That was because it was full of monstrous remains, most of them belonging to truly harrowing nightmare creatures. There were grotesque bones, hollowed-out carapaces of vile abominations, and odd artifacts of all kinds. The remains of the winter beast were here. Shards of frozen shadows were here, too, among other trophies Sonny had collected in the past 4 years. He walked to the middle of the vast underground storage and turned to Nephi's, pointing around. A powerful memory has to be crafted from potent materials. Otherwise, it won't survive the burden of its own enchantments. The remains of nightmare creatures are the most easily accessible source of such materials, albeit not the only source. Nephi's looked around with subdued interest. Have you chanced upon the remains of an unholy abomination, then? Is that what gives you the confidence to claim that you can forge a god-slaying sword? Sonny smiled and shook his head. No, actually, what I wanted to show you is not the materials, but rather the storage itself. Have you noticed how large it is? Nephi's nodded slowly, prompting Sonny to smile. Saint Cassia must have informed you that my shop is actually an ascended devil. In fact, the volume of its interior seems a bit too vast, doesn't it? She lingered for a bit, then shrugged. It is hard to say without knowing what creature you killed to receive this echo. But yes, I would have expected it to be much smaller. Dimensional storage memories of the ascended rank are usually much more modest. Sonny pointed at himself. But you see, this dimensional storage is a bit unique, because its volume does not depend on the creature's rank and class, but rather on the potency of the creature's master's soul, which, in this case, would be my soul. Nephi's remained silent for a moment. It seems that you have an unusually potent soul, then. He chuckled, causing a small smile to appear on her lips. Thank you for the compliment. That is not the point, though. She frowned, then suddenly pierced him with an intense gaze. Do you mean to say? Sonny nodded. Indeed, it is not impossible for me to create a memory that is bound to its wielder's soul, and is thus as powerful as the wielder is. You strike me as someone who will continue to grow stronger, Lady Nephi's. So, it is not impossible for your sword to become sharp enough to slay a god, one day. Sonny was being a little dishonest, but only a little. In truth, his ambition was not to replicate the enchantments of the covetous coffer. What he was after, and had been trying to achieve for a while now, was to replicate the bound trait of the onyx mantle, which was responsible for that attribute of his being as potent as his soul was. The reason for that was the shift in his perception of power and his views of memories after becoming transcendent. Sonny had long realized that truly powerful beings did not pursue greater power from the weapons they wielded and the tools they used, because they themselves were the power. The weapons and the tools were only meant to channel their own strength, not be a source of external might. And yet, it had always been the opposite for Sonny. He had made himself into a lethal warrior, yes, but most of his victories came from cleverly using the enchantments of his powerful memories, which he could utilize better than other awakened due to his eyes having been altered by blood weave. Being banished from the spell, he had lost most of these memories. That had shown him, in a rather cruel manner, the difference between internal and external power. So, even though Sonny could craft himself a diverse arsenal of potent memories, he had not done so, because he was powerful enough to not need it, and did not wish to be led astray by excessive reliance on undeserved strength. He would rather achieve such strength himself. That way, he would be following in the footsteps of those who were truly divine. So, the only memories Sonny wanted to craft for himself were those that would help him channel his own power better, or provide simple convenience. He also wanted these memories to be able to keep up with his progress. Therefore, he had to master the bound, enchantment. The problem was that forging a memory that possessed such a trait was not easy, since it had to be intricately tied to one's very soul. But it would be different if Nephis and her soul flame, as well as the crown of dawn, were there to help him. Nephis remained silent for a while, considering what the charming enchanter had said. A weapon that was as powerful as its wielder was. Slowly, white sparks ignited in the depths of her eyes. A growing memory. They did exist, but were exceedingly rare. Most of the ones she heard of had not even been received from slaying nightmare creatures, but were instead aspect legacy relics. Having a sword that would allow her to fully express the power of her aspect was already exciting enough. But if that sword could also reflect her power as a transcendent titan, and one who had inherited the lineage of sun god as well, such a blade would indeed be worthy of slaying gods. As long as Nephis was worthy. She glanced at Master Sunless, who remained calm and composed. Was he really capable of forging such a memory? Suddenly, the young man seemed to possess a different kind of allure in her eyes. He's precious, a precious resource, I mean. Cassie has really outdone herself this time. If what he had said was true. Nephis hesitated for a moment. Can you really do it? Master Sunless gave her an electric smile. I haven't done it before, but I am confident that it can be achieved. It might be that nobody else is capable, but I am. She raised an eyebrow, finding it hard to distrust his confidence. Not just because it was hard to imagine someone who looked like him being dishonest, but also because she could vaguely sense his passion. Nephis had no doubt that Master Sunless was an inspired artisan. She was familiar with artistic ambition, and his was of the kind that could produce miracles. Of course, he could simply be delusional, but Cassie would not have sent her here if there was any doubt about his ability. How had Valor failed to scout this talent? She looked away, studying the abominable remains surrounding them. It was quite a collection. Since the charming young man did not seem like much of a fighter, he must have procured these material with soul shards and coin. That alone spoke volumes of his dedication. Nephis sighed. How are you so different from all the other enchanters? He smiled. It is simple, really. Have you read the exploration report of the tomb of Ariel? Master Sunless suddenly fell silent, and then paled a little. In quite an endearing way. Oh, I am deeply sorry, Lady Nephis. I said something stupid. You were there yourself. He shifted from one foot to another, trying to hide his embarrassment. In any case, you must be familiar with the cult of the nightmare spell mentioned in the report. There used to be sorcerers of a very special kind among those cultists, called weavers. Nephis nodded. Indeed so. The young enchanter hesitated for a moment. Every person creating memories today is capable of doing so because of their aspect. In truth, they aren't the ones who are making the memories. It's the nightmare spell who does it for them. He pointed to one of his onyx eyes. But I am different. Due to one of my attributes, I possess the ability to see the sorceress weave of memories, and since I can see it, I can strive to understand it. So, my memories are not the product of a symbiotic fusion between my aspect and the nightmare spell. They are a product of skill. My skill, which I have bitterly honed and improved upon for many years. Nephis listened to his words intently. What she heard was rather wondrous. It was a good reminder to never underestimate people. This humble young man did not seem outstanding when compared to thousands of other masters and the exalted saints. He lived his life quietly, away from the spotlight and lacking fame. And yet he too was a singular existence. In his unique craft, there was no one more accomplished. There were an infinite number of attributes, aspects, and memories out there. Anyone could be a wonder in their own way, and be capable of things that everyone else would think impossible. Nephi's made a decision. I'll trust in his skill. There was no downside to trusting the charming enchanter anyway. Even if he failed, Nephi's would simply be back to where she had started, lacking a weapon to face the sovereigns, but having no other choice. She suddenly found herself responding to his slight smile with one of her own. In that case, I commend your ingenuity and persistence, Master Sunless. Nephi's lingered for a moment, then asked, You mentioned that creating such a sword would require a lot of effort from both of us, and that we would have to spend a long time together. What did you mean? He sighed, then gestured for her to leave the ominous storage room. As they passed the elegant shopfront of the Memory Boutique and returned to the dining hall of the cafe, the charming young man explained in a pleasant tone. The first part is easier to answer. In short, I will need your assistance at certain stages of forging. It is no secret that your flames are born from the soul, Lady Nephi's, so I'm inclined to believe that they are most suitable for forging a soul-bound weapon. He remained silent for a moment, then continued hesitantly. The second part is more sensitive. Usually, I don't have much problem selecting suitable enchantments for the memories I create, but this one will be rather special, and so, it must fit you and your powers perfectly. Such a fit won't be possible unless I have a deep understanding of your powers and how you conduct yourself in battle. It would be very helpful for me to observe your swordsmanship and your aspect closely, and not just in a sparring ring. Nephi's gave him a curious look. Are you very knowledgeable about swordsmanship, Master Sunless? The charming young man smiled. Well, I might not look it, but I do indeed know a thing or two about swordsmanship, as well as how to wield other weapons. After all, if one wants to forge a weapon, they have to know how to wield one, don't they? He paused for a moment, looked around, and then said with a hint of badly hidden pride in his voice, Actually, I don't want to brag, but I once placed very high in the Dreamscape tournament. Nephi's blinked. The Dreamscape tournament. That illusory game. Suddenly, she felt a very unfamiliar emotion rise in her cold and scorched heart. The contrast between the shy pride written all over the charming enchanter's beautiful face and the sheer silliness of the thing he was so proud of was so cute. Nephi's had to look away. Ah, I see, how remarkable. Well, in that case, we can arrange something. With that, she took a deep breath and headed for the door. It's getting late and I need to return to the castle. We will be in touch. Oh, and thank you for the cake, Master Sunless. It was delicious. He seemed a little startled. It was, all right, I'll be waiting then. Good night, Lady Nephi's. The silver bell rang melodiously as she left. Walking outside, Nephi's felt the cool wind caress her cheeks. She kept her expression neutral as she headed toward the ferry to the castle. Well, what do you think? Cassie's voice resounded in her head a moment later. Nephi's contemplated for a few moments. I like what I saw. Even if he fails to forge a worthy sword for me, we should work on recruiting him as a memory master for the Fire Keepers. Cassie remained silent for a bit. You liked what you saw, huh? Nephi's did not deign to reply. Why was Cassie acting so mischievously these days? Well, actually, she was glad to see her friend coming back to a semblance of normalcy. Although very few people noticed, Cassie had not been doing well for the last few years. It was a good sign if she was in the mood to joke around. Nephi's felt relived. Just as she thought that, though, her friend suddenly spoke again. But Neph, I have a little piece of advice. You know, just something to think about. The next time you meet a young man and like what you see, maybe don't start the conversation by demanding to know if he can satisfy your needs. You might give him the wrong idea. Nephi's frowned. What is she talking about? Satisfy my? She thought back to her conversation with Master Sunless and froze. Suddenly, the wind did not feel so cool anymore. Blushing deeply, Nephi's covered her face and walked away. Her steps might have been a little hurried. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.